the perfume that isn't mine. My name is Rachel Whitmore, and I discovered my husband was cheating when I smelled perfume on his clothes that wasn't mine. Not once. Not a one-time occurrence that could be explained away as an accidental encounter at work or a hug from a friendly colleague at a holiday party. Every week, for months, the same distinctive scent clinging to his shirts and jackets, woven into the fabric like evidence that refused to fade even after multiple washings. The perfume was expensive. I could tell that much without knowing the brand. It had that quality that separates department store fragrances from drugstore body spray. Complex, layered, lingering, floral, but not sweet. Sophisticated, the kind of scent a woman chooses carefully, pays $150 for at Nordstrom or Saks, applies with intention rather than spraying carelessly from a bottle that costs $19.99. It wasn't my perfume. I wore Chanel No. 5. Had worn it since college when my mother had given me a bottle for my 21st birthday and told me that a signature scent was part of a woman's identity. I'd been loyal to it for 15 years. Andrew knew that scent as intimately as he knew my voice or my handwriting. This wasn't No. 5. This was something else entirely. I first noticed it in late September, about 4 months ago. Andrew had come home from one of his Wednesday evening volunteer shifts at the Hospice Center, smelling like flowers and something musky I couldn't identify. I'd mentioned it casually. New air freshener at the hospice? Maybe, he'd said, shrugging. I didn't notice. But it happened again the next Wednesday. And the Wednesday after that, and every Wednesday for the past 4 months. Andrew would leave for his volunteer shift at 5 p.m. He'd been volunteering at Nashville Alive Hospice for 3 years, ever since his father had died there, and Andrew had been so moved by the compassionate care that he'd wanted to give back. He'd spend 3 hours visiting with patients who had no family, reading to them, sitting with them, being present for people at the end of their lives who otherwise would have died alone. It was beautiful work. Noble work, the kind of thing that made me proud to be married to someone who cared that deeply about strangers, who gave his Wednesday evenings to people who had nothing to offer him in return, except gratitude and the knowledge that their final days weren't spent in isolation. Except apparently Andrew's Wednesday evenings weren't just about hospice volunteering anymore. They were also about spending time close enough to a woman wearing expensive perfume that the scent transferred to his clothes and stayed there despite my best efforts, with stain remover and odor eliminator, and eventually just accepting that his Wednesday shirt smelled like another woman. I tried to find innocent explanations. Maybe there was a female volunteer who wore too much perfume and stood too close. Maybe one of the patients had a daughter who visited and hugged Andrew in gratitude for spending time with her dying mother. Maybe the hospice had started using scented cleaning products or diffusers that happened to smell like women's perfume, even though that seemed unlikely in a medical facility where scents could trigger nausea in patients undergoing treatment. But none of those explanations accounted for how thoroughly the scent saturated his clothes. This wasn't ambient fragrance from being in a room where someone had sprayed perfume earlier. This was close contact, prolonged proximity, physical touch that allowed scent to transfer from one person's skin to another person's clothing. I started paying closer attention to the other signs. Andrew had been different lately, not dramatically different, not suddenly cold or distant, in ways that would have triggered immediate alarm, but subtly changed in ways I couldn't quite name. More attentive to his appearance. He'd started going to the gym again after a 2-year hiatus, had lost 15 pounds, had bought new clothes that fit his leaner frame. He smiled at his phone more often, seemed distracted during conversations, like part of his attention was always somewhere else. I'd attributed these changes to positive things. The gym was good. Andrew was 42 and needed to take care of his cardiovascular health. The weight loss was attractive. The new clothes were an upgrade from the dated wardrobe he'd been wearing since we'd met. The phone distraction was probably work stress. Andrew was a software engineer at a healthcare tech company and was always dealing with some crisis involving electronic medical records or system integration or whatever other technical problems kept developers up at night. But now, with the perfume as a constant reminder that something was wrong, all those positive changes looked different. They looked like the changes men make when they're trying to impress someone new, when they're rebuilding themselves for an audience that isn't their wife of 13 years. I called my best friend Morgan on a Friday afternoon in January, 3 days after Andrew had come home from another Wednesday volunteer shift, smelling like that perfume again. And I'd finally admitted to myself that innocent explanations weren't enough anymore. "I think Andrew is having an affair," I said without preamble when she answered. Morgan had been my college roommate at Vanderbilt, had been my maid of honor at my wedding, had been present for every major moment of my adult life. She knew me well enough to know I didn't make dramatic pronouncements without evidence. "Why do you think that?" she asked carefully. "He smells like perfume every Wednesday after his hospice volunteer shift. The same perfume. For 4 months. Expensive perfume that's definitely not mine. And he's been different. Working out, losing weight, buying new clothes, always on his phone, all the classic signs. Have you asked him about it?" I asked about the perfume once. He said he didn't notice it. "And you believed him?" I wanted to believe him, but I don't anymore. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know. Confront him? Follow him to his next volunteer shift? Hire a private investigator? I feel like I'm going crazy. Like I'm becoming one of those suspicious wives who can't trust their husbands. But I can't ignore the evidence anymore." "Don't ignore it. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. But before you confront him, gather more evidence. Make sure you're not jumping to conclusions based on perfume and circumstantial lifestyle changes." That afternoon, I did something I'd never done before in 13 years of marriage. I went through Andrew's phone. He'd left it charging on the kitchen counter while he was in the shower, and I'd picked it up with my heart pounding, like I was committing a crime, rather than trying to protect myself from betrayal. His passcode was our anniversary, 0612, which felt like either innocence or arrogance, depending on how you interpreted it. The phone unlocked easily. I went straight to his messages, expecting to find texts from a woman with a name I didn't recognize, proof of an affair documented in emoji, in late-night conversations. Instead, I found messages to his sister Emily, to his co-workers, to his friends from his running group. Nothing suspicious, nothing hidden. His email was equally innocent. Work correspondence, newsletters, promotional messages from retailers. His calendar showed his Wednesday evening commitment. Hospice, 5 to 8 p.m., repeating every week. No hidden appointments, no secret meetings scheduled under fake names. I felt simultaneously relieved and more confused. If Andrew was having an affair, he was being remarkably careful about hiding it, or I was wrong. Or the affair wasn't the kind that involved texting and scheduling, was instead spontaneous and opportunistic and happening during those Wednesday evening hours he claimed to be volunteering. The next Wednesday, I followed him. I took off work early, told my boss I had a dentist appointment I'd forgotten to calendar, and parked down the street from the hospice center where Andrew volunteered. Watched him arrive at 5:03 p.m., park in the visitor lot, walk inside carrying the backpack he always brought. I'd assumed it contained a book to read to patients, maybe some snacks, whatever supplies volunteers needed for 3 hours of sitting with dying people. I waited in my car for 3 hours, watched the entrance, saw nurses and doctors and visitors come and go, saw Andrew not come back out. At 8:11 p.m., Andrew emerged from the building, but he wasn't alone. He was with a woman. She was maybe 70 years old, thin in the way cancer makes people thin, wearing a pink knit hat that suggested she'd lost her hair to chemotherapy. They walked slowly. She was using a walker, Andrew, matching her pace, his hand hovering near her elbow, ready to steady her if she stumbled. They stopped at a car in the parking lot. Andrew opened the passenger door, helped her into the seat, with the careful gentleness you use with people who are fragile, whose bones might break if you're not careful. Then he drove away in her car while she sat in the passenger seat. I followed them, felt ridiculous doing it. This clearly wasn't an affair unless Andrew was having a relationship with a terminally ill 70-year-old woman, which seemed unlikely. But I'd come this far. I needed to see where they were going. They drove to a small house in Inglewood, one of Nashville's older neighborhoods where houses were modest and yards were small and everything felt lived in and tired. Andrew parked in the driveway, helped the woman out of the car, walked with her to the front door. They went inside together. I parked down the street and waited. 15 minutes passed. 20. 30. At 43 minutes, Andrew emerged alone, locked the front door behind him, walked back to the car, and drove away. I followed him back to the hospice center, where he parked the woman's car in the visitor lot, got into his own car, and drove home. I beat him there by 5 minutes. Was sitting on the couch pretending to read a book when he walked in at 8:54 p.m., right on schedule, smelling like that perfume. How was volunteering? I asked, keeping my voice casual. Good. Quiet night. Read to a woman with dementia. She doesn't recognize her own family anymore, but she remembered all the words to the hymns we sang together. He was lying, or he was telling a partial truth. He'd clearly spent time at the hospice. I'd watched him enter the building, but he'd also left with that woman, driven her home, stayed at her house for 43 minutes, and come back smelling like perfume. Tell me about the patients you visit, I said. I realize I don't know much about what you actually do there every week. He sat down, started talking about the people he visited. Names I'd heard before in passing. Margaret, who'd been an opera singer. William, who'd been a Korean War veteran. Patricia, who'd been a high school English teacher and still corrected his grammar when he read to her. He talked about them with genuine affection, with the kind of detail that came from actually knowing these people, from spending a real time with them. Is there anyone new? I asked. Anyone you've started visiting recently? Something flickered across his face. Not quite guilt. More like careful consideration of how to answer. There's Eleanor, he said. I started visiting her about 4 months ago. September. She's different from the other patients. Different how? She's not dying at the hospice. She's outpatient, comes in for treatment a few days a week, but lives at home the rest of the time. She has late-stage ovarian cancer. No family. Her daughter died in a car accident 3 years ago. Her husband died 5 years before that. She's alone. Completely alone. And she's terrified of dying by herself in her house, with no one to find her until the smell alerts the neighbors. The perfume. I suddenly understood. Does Eleanor wear perfume? Andrew looked at me carefully. Yes. Why? You smell like perfume every Wednesday when you come home. Expensive perfume. I've been noticing it for months. His face did something complicated. Not quite relief, but something close to it. You thought I was having an affair. What else was I supposed to think? You come home every week smelling like another woman's perfume. You've been different, working out, losing weight, distracted. All the signs were there. Rachel, Eleanor is 73 years old. She's dying. We're not Jesus. You really thought I was cheating on you with a hospice patient? I didn't know she was 73 until I followed you tonight. Until I watched you drive her home and help her inside, and then come back smelling like perfume. You followed me. I followed you because you've been lying to me. I haven't been lying. I've been volunteering exactly where I said I was volunteering. But you left. You drove a patient home. That's not standard volunteering. That's something else. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, Eleanor can't drive anymore. The cancer, the chemo. It's affected her vision, her reaction time. She's not safe behind the wheel. But she refuses to stop living in her house. Refuses to move into full-time hospice care, even though she probably should. She wants to die at home, in her own bed, surrounded by her own things. So you drive her? So I drive her. Every Wednesday after her treatment at the hospice, I drive her home in her car, make sure she's settled, make sure she has her medications and food and everything she needs. Then I walk back to the hospice. It's about 2 miles, and drive myself home. It adds an hour to my volunteer shift. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to worry about me walking through Inglewood at night. Didn't want you to think I was overstepping boundaries with a patient. Didn't want to make it into a big thing when it's just helping. Just being there for someone who has no one else. She wears perfume while she's dying of cancer. She does. It's called Joy by Jean Patou. Costs $200 a bottle. She told me her husband bought it for her on their honeymoon in Paris in 1972. She's worn it every day for 53 years. Says it reminds her of being young and in love and believing life would last forever. She's down to her last bottle. When it runs out, there won't be more. But she wears it anyway. Every day. Even though she's dying. Especially because she's dying. I felt something shift inside me. Guilt mixing with relief, mixing with a complicated sadness for a woman I'd never met who was dying alone while wearing perfume from her honeymoon. I want to meet her, I said. Eleanor? Yes. If you're spending an extra hour every Wednesday, driving her home and making sure she's okay, if she's important enough to you that you've been doing this for 4 months, I want to meet her. The next Wednesday, I went with Andrew to the hospice, met Eleanor in the common room where outpatients waited for their treatment sessions. She was small, bird fragile, wearing that pink knit hat and a sweater that hung loose on her diminished frame. But her makeup was perfect, lipstick carefully applied, blush placed with precision, eyebrows drawn where chemotherapy had erased her natural ones. And she smelled like Joy by Jean Patou, the perfume I'd been smelling on Andrew's clothes for months, the scent I'd mistaken for evidence of an affair. You must be Rachel, Eleanor said when Andrew introduced us. Her voice was soft but clear. The voice of someone who'd been a singer or a teacher, or someone whose profession required speaking to audiences. Andrew talks about you constantly, says you're patient with him, which is generous given how much time he spends here instead of home with you. He says he's helping people, I said. That seems worth supporting. He's helped me more than he knows. I was terrified of dying alone, of being one of those people who dies in their house and isn't found for days or weeks until someone notices the mail piling up or the smell seeping under the door. Andrew's been my insurance against that. He checks on me, makes sure I'm not dying on my kitchen floor, with no one to call 911. "How long do you have?" I asked, then immediately regretted the bluntness. But Eleanor smiled. "Weeks, maybe a month if I'm lucky. The cancer's everywhere now. Liver, lungs, spine. They can't do anything except manage pain and make me comfortable. I'm ready. I've had a good life. 73 years. Married to a man I loved for 45 of them. Raised a daughter who was brilliant and kind until a drunk driver took her away. I've seen enough, done enough. I'm ready to go. But not alone. But not alone. That's the only thing that still scares me. And he's been my person. The one who'll notice if I don't show up for treatment. The one who'll find me if something happens between Wednesdays. It's morbid to think about, but it's comfort too. Knowing someone will care. Over the next weeks, I went with Andrew most Wednesdays. Got to know Eleanor in the way you get to know someone at the end of their life. Quickly, intensely, with the kind of honesty that comes when there's no time left for pretense. She told me about her husband James, who'd been an architect, about their honeymoon in Paris, where he'd bought her the Joy perfume at a boutique near their hotel, about wearing it every day since because it made her feel close to him, even after he died. She told me about her daughter Amy, who'd been a pediatric oncologist, who'd spent her career trying to save children from the disease that was now killing her mother. About the car accident on I-40 that had taken Amy at age 38, had left Eleanor without the daughter, who would have been there now, who would have been holding her mother's hand through the dying process, instead of Eleanor facing it with strangers and volunteers. She told me about the photos on her walls at home, generations of family, going back to the early 1900s, ancestors she'd never met, but whose faces she'd memorized. About wanting to die in that house surrounded by those faces, surrounded by evidence that she'd been part of something larger than just her own life. I sprayed joy every morning, Eleanor told me one Wednesday in February. I know it's foolish. I know perfume doesn't matter when you're dying, but it makes me feel like myself, like I'm still Eleanor Jenkins, who married James in 1972 and wore this perfume on her wedding day and has worn it ever since. Not just Eleanor, the cancer patient. Not just the sick old woman everyone pities. It's not foolish, I said. It's remembering who you are when everything else is trying to erase you. In late February, Eleanor stopped coming to the hospice for treatment. She declined to the point where traveling was too difficult, where the treatment was just prolonging inevitable decline rather than providing any quality of life. She called Andrew and asked if he'd still visit her at home now that she wasn't at the hospice anymore. Of course, Andrew said. Wednesday nights are yours. That doesn't change just because you're not coming to the center. So Wednesdays became home visits. Andrew would go to Eleanor's house straight from work. I'd join him when I could, when I didn't have my own work obligations or commitments. We'd sit with her in her living room, surrounded by those family photos. Would read to her when she was too tired to talk. Would just be present when presence was all she wanted. She was fading, visibly, measurably fading week by week. Her speech became slower. Her lucidity came and went. Some days she knew who we were and carried on complete conversations. Other days she thought Andrew was James, called him by her dead husband's name, asked him questions about their honeymoon as if it had happened last month instead of 53 years ago. On those days, Andrew would answer as James, would talk about Paris and the boutique where they'd bought the perfume and how beautiful she'd looked on their wedding day. Would slip into the role of the husband Eleanor needed to believe was there, because correcting her felt cruel when she had so little time left and so few sources of comfort. I watched him do this with a tenderness that made me ashamed of every moment I doubted him, every suspicion I'd harbored about affairs and betrayal. This wasn't an affair. This was compassion so profound it required becoming someone else for a dying woman who needed her dead husband more than she needed truth. The last time I saw Eleanor was a Wednesday in mid-March. We arrived at her house to find her barely conscious, breathing in that distinctive way that hospice nurses call transitional. Irregular, shallow, the breathing of someone whose body is shutting down. Andrew called hospice. They sent a nurse who examined Eleanor, checked her vital signs, confirmed what we already knew. Hours, the nurse said quietly, maybe less. She's actively dying. You can stay if you want. Sometimes people wait for permission to go. Sometimes having someone present helps them let go. We stayed, sat on either side of Eleanor's bed in her small bedroom with its faded wallpaper and family photos on every surface. Andrew held one of her hands. I held the other. We didn't talk. There was nothing to say. We just sat with her while she died. She passed at 9:47 p.m. One moment breathing, the next moment not. The transition so quiet and gentle that for a few seconds I wasn't sure it had happened. Then the nurse checked for a pulse, listened for breath sounds, pronounced what we already knew. She's gone, the nurse said. I'm sorry for your loss. Andrew was crying. Actually crying in a way I'd rarely seen him cry, even at his own father's funeral. I'm glad we were here, he said. I'm glad she wasn't alone. We stayed while the nurse made arrangements for the body to be transported. While Eleanor's attorney was notified, she'd named him as her health care power of attorney since she had no family, while the house was locked up and secured. As we were leaving, I noticed the bottle of joy by Jean Patou on Eleanor's dresser. It was nearly empty, maybe 2 or 3 applications left. She'd worn her honeymoon perfume until the very end, had insisted on remaining herself even as cancer tried to erase who she'd been. Can we take it? I asked Andrew. The perfume. Keep it as a reminder. He picked up the bottle carefully. Eleanor would want that. She'd want someone to remember that she wore joy every day, that she chose to die smelling like Paris and James and their wedding day. That bottle sits on my dresser now. I've never worn it. It's not my scent, and using Eleanor's perfume would feel like appropriating something that belonged to someone else's love story. But I keep it as a reminder of the 4 months I thought my husband was having an affair when he was actually helping a stranger die with dignity. The perfume taught me something about trust and suspicion and the stories we tell ourselves when we're scared. I'd seen evidence that looked like betrayal. Perfume on clothes, lifestyle changes, secretive behavior, and I'd constructed an entire narrative of infidelity because that narrative fit the evidence better than the truth. The truth was stranger and sadder and more beautiful than an affair. The truth was my husband spending his Wednesday evenings with a dying woman who had no one else, helping her maintain her independence, driving her home, making sure she didn't die alone in her house like she feared. The truth was Andrew letting a woman with dementia believe he was her dead husband because gentle deception felt kinder than harsh reality. The truth was him crying when Eleanor died because he genuinely cared about her, had seen her not as a patient or a charity case, but as a person whose life mattered, whose death deserved to be witnessed. I'd followed him expecting to find evidence of an affair. Instead, I'd found evidence of compassion, of kindness, of my husband being exactly the person I'd always hoped he was, the person I'd doubted because perfume and circumstantial evidence had made suspicion feel more logical than faith. Last week, Andrew started volunteering again on Wednesday nights. New patients, new people facing death alone, new opportunities to be present for strangers who need someone to care that they exist, that their deaths won't go unnoticed. He came home last Wednesday smelling like different perfume, something citrus and light. I didn't ask who was wearing it, didn't follow him, didn't check his phone or his calendar or construct elaborate theories about affairs. I just said, "Tell me about them. Tell me about whoever you're helping this time." And he did. Told me about Margaret, 81, former opera singer, who hums Puccini while she sleeps and wears Chanel number 19 because it reminds her of her mother, who's terrified of dying without singing one more aria. So Andrew found recordings of her performances from the 1960s and plays them for her while she listens with tears streaming down her face. That's what the perfume means now. Not betrayal, but service. Not evidence of an affair, but evidence of Andrew spending his Wednesday evenings with dying people who wear perfume to remember who they were before cancer tried to erase them. Eleanor's bottle of joy sits on my dresser, nearly empty. A reminder that sometimes the perfume you smell on your husband's clothes is evidence of him being close to death and grief and human frailty, not evidence of him being close to another woman. That's the story of the perfume that wasn't mine, not an affair, but a dying woman's last connection to her honeymoon and her husband and herself. Not betrayal, but compassion profound enough to sit with strangers while they die. Not evidence of loving someone else, but evidence of loving humanity enough to witness its ending. I keep Eleanor's perfume bottle as a reminder to choose faith over suspicion when evidence could support either, to ask questions before constructing narratives, to remember that my husband is exactly who I've always believed him to be: kind, compassionate, present for people who need him, even when being present costs him his Wednesday evenings and makes his wife smell perfume she doesn't recognize and wonder what it means. It means he's helping someone die with dignity. That's what it means. That's all it ever meant. And I'm grateful I discovered the truth before my suspicions destroyed something that deserved to be preserved.